Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, and welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Jacqueline Whitt, Professor of Strategy and the War Room podcast editor here at the U.S. Army War College. Thanks for joining us for today's episode. So over the last few years, we've heard lots of discussions about the involvement of foreign fighters in civil wars and insurgencies, and their engagement in wars such as those in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, as well as questions about what happens when they return home, have been pretty consistent topics of conversation in the national security community. So here to discuss these important topics and to give us maybe a little bit of historical perspective as well as a contemporary one, I'm very pleased to have in the recording studio Dr. David Malet, who is an assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. So thanks for joining us here at the War Room.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
Great. So it seems like every podcast I've been doing lately starts with a definitional question. So you will be no different. To kick us off, what exactly is a foreign fighter?
So foreign fighters are one of those things that there's no consensus definition for, but I've been working on this since 2005. This is actually my research on this started out as part of my doctoral dissertation. And at the time, I was very much interested in people who were going off to Iraq during the conflict at that time. So I was looking specifically at insurgents, and there was not a lot of set definitions at the time. So the one I ended up creating then was that foreign fighters are individuals who are not citizens of a state where there's a conflict, but who travel to that state to become part of the non-government forces, part of the insurgencies.
Okay, so it's specifically we're talking about civil wars and insurgencies. Is there a particular historical moment where we start to see these come into being?
Yeah, when you're looking just at insurgencies, you're kind of stuck looking for civil wars. You certainly have a lot of history of people going off and joining multinational forces. You can go back to the Crusades period for that and technically say, all right, these are sort of foreign fighter armies. The data sets that I was working with on civil wars really go back to some of the conflict sets that go back to the Napoleonic Wars era, the modern international system, 1815.
Okay.
And I was kind of surprised that foreign fighters are a lot more prevalent than I thought they would be. If you look at all the civil wars in the last 200 years, you can document foreign fighters with insurgencies in more than a quarter of them.
Okay.
So that's cases where rebel groups were able to persuade or somehow entice volunteers to come from other countries. And in half those cases, those were people not just spilling across the border from local sort of groups.
Not necessarily from border regions, but...
Well, that's right. That was one question I was interested in when I started doing the research back in last decade, was how many of these are just sort of spillover effects from civil wars and how many of them are cases where people traveled transnationally. Because at the time, it's always a dicey proposition to join an insurgency. They don't usually win. Most of the data, depending whose you are using, shows insurgencies will win a quarter of the time, a third of the time. So to go join a rebel group fighting against what are usually the strongest powers in the international system in a country that you've never been, where in a lot of cases you have no family ties, and it turns out the groups, as I started doing the research, were not soliciting mercenaries. They were telling people, we can't pay you. So to do it for really no good promises whatsoever struck me as a really interesting question. How do they get them to do that?
Yeah, so because these aren't, like you said, they're not mercenaries. They're not sort of maybe like in a foreign legion. It's not what, right, the Hessians in the American Revolution or even the French Navy, right? This is individuals sort of making a choice to go fight in a conflict that maybe isn't their own.
And joining non-state actors so they don't have legal protections.
Right, as combatants.
That's right.
Right. So if we think about, and like I said, the contemporary conflicts, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, the Great Lakes region in Central Africa, all of these are places where we're going to see foreign fighters. But like you said, it's an older phenomenon. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the older historical cases, maybe as a point of comparison?
Sure. I mean, you can go back to the American Revolution and see the difference purely on the rebel side from people from like John Paul Jones came from Scotland and Thaddeus Kosciuszko came from what's now Poland, and of course Lafayette and some others. And it's funny because some of them went back to Europe after the war and sort of networked with each other and got involved in sort of revolutions at home. But with the data I'm working with, you have starting in the 1820s, you have Americans who went and fought in the Greek War of Independence, right, with Lord Byron from Britain. You have cases. I mean, today you have thousands of people from as far away as South America and South Asia going and fighting in Ukraine. There were the cases that I looked at in depth for my my case studies, comparing how different groups recruit people, who they target. Were 4 different historical case studies, just because it was so hard to get current data, and it still is. I mean, the numbers that we have for Syria are kind of not reliable. They keep shifting back and forth.
Well, in the middle of a conflict, it seems also really difficult to get good, solid numbers on almost anything.
And certainly, if you're going to be a foreign fighter, which has been illegal, it was illegal in the U.S. since George Washington was in the White House. It's been a questionable status. It's completely illegal everywhere now in the world today.
So to say, like, Americans, for example, can't go and join a rebel group or a insurgent group.
No, we passed a law in the 1790s banning that.
All right, so that's good legal. I feel like that's solid legal advice.
It's good advice. Not to, I mean, this technically, we prosecute if you're seen as basically being a threat to the U.S., if you're seen as attacking U.S. interests. The State Department says we don't like it if you go join some other group, but really they only do something about it if you're with a group that's seen as hostile to the U.S. or if you take a commission in one of these foreign armies or foreign movements.
So I got us distracted, but you were talking about the historical case studies. I think I'm a historian, so I think historical case studies are always really interesting.
Okay, so I was actually trying to answer some questions in the Civil War literature about whether ethnic conflicts or ideological conflicts are more likely to get foreign governments involved in them. And so I looked at ethnic conflicts, and I looked at some non-ethnic conflicts, and I was really interested because there were some ethnic conflicts where people who were foreign fighters joined the rebels, but they weren't from the same ethnic group as them. And I was wondering what could possibly interest them in this conflict. So I ended up looking at 4 different historical cases with different variables of ethnicity, and with the fighters and with the wars. I ended up looking at, just reverse chronologically, I ended up with Afghanistan in the 1980s, sort of the start of the jihad movement today. Mostly diaspora Jews who fought in the Israeli War of Independence in the 1940s. The Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, which appears to be the biggest case of foreign fighters in terms of numbers. We had 50 to 60,000 people going to Spain in under 3 years, so a lot bigger than what we're seeing in Syria now. And then actually I ended up, for my 4th case, looking at the Texas Revolution in the 1830s, where Texas was a Mexican state. It was one of several Mexican states trying to break away, and Texas was the only one that actually got away with it, in part because it had a lot of fighters coming in from the U.S., some from Europe, who built a lot of international sympathy because the Mexican government was basically executing them on the spot, making the argument these guys are pirates. They're threatening our sovereignty. If you look at the Alamo, Battle of the Alamo, there were 200 Alamo defenders there on the rebel side, but only 10 of them were actually from Texas. There were 3 times as many European nationals who'd responded to messages about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants being under threat from this Hispanic
Catholic sort of encroachment.
That's right.
So this is I think this is really fascinating, because I wouldn't have expected those numbers even from the Alamo. Maybe my U.S. history training or education has been clearly lacking. But is this a pattern that we see? Why do people become foreign fighters? Why do people go and fight in wars that are not, maybe that outsiders wouldn't see as their own?
So what I found that was really interesting when I was working on my dissertation, which was then published in 2009 as a book, or actually it was finished in 2009, it was published in 2013 as a book, which was just had a new edition in 2017, updated for the ISIS era. It's called Foreign Fighters, Transnational Identity in Civil Conflicts with Oxford University Press. And I think it's actually held up pretty well with what we've seen in the ISIS era too. The argument that I made based on what I found 10 years ago was that because rebel groups they want to try to bolster their strength, they try to get outside support, but they can't offer pay credibly. They can't offer protections and likelihood of surviving. So what they'll do is they will find people elsewhere in the world, if they can't get support from foreign governments, who are sympathetic to them. And, they are already active in religious or ethnic or ideological groups. And they say, hey, forget your citizenship. And a lot of times the people that they approach are marginalized in their countries where they're living, or they feel that way. And they say, you're real people as our group. And we're under dire existential threat. They're going to come wipe us all out. So it's your responsibility to come do something about it. They oftentimes use a lot of atrocity propaganda. They will use very gendered approaches to young men in particular, saying that the women are under threat. You have to do something and be a hero.
To protect women and children and...
Exactly. And sometimes it's all too true, like in Bosnia in the 1990s, but other times they will be a lot more creative about these stories. And they say it's your duty to the community to do something about this. You'll be a hero, and if you don't do it, they're going to come for you next where you live, so it's really in your self-interest. So they can't pay them, but they make the cost of not acting on this sort of guilt trip higher. And
you said these are sort of people who are already engaged or active in some way, but maybe marginalized in their own. Are those the ways that we would say categorize like who tends to become?
I think there's a pretty common profile that you can establish without using racial or religious markers, right?
Mm-hmm.
In every one of these cases, which is, shouldn't be surprised that they typically go for guys who are, let's say, around 20 years old, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger in some cases. They tend to be, in Western countries anyway, they tend to be first or second generation immigrants. So they have some extended ties, in some cases, to at least a group that's aligned with the conflict, if not the group itself. I've noticed there's sort of a high incidence of I guess you'd call broken homes, where they have families that are not, nuclear families are not intact, or they, perhaps because of immigration, they've been cut off from extended families. So I think that's why they tend to identify with these identity groups, because they become surrogate families and worth fighting for.
Okay.
You have people who were involved in union groups who were recruited to go to Spain in the name of stopping the fascists, and they said basically their groups were related to the Communist Party in the U.S. in the 1930s, and they were told, hey, if you don't come to Spain, we're throwing you out of the party, you're cut off. And they didn't, and both for their livelihoods with their unions, but also because that was their social network, they thought, all right, I'd better volunteer before they do that.
So creating a group identity, an identity based on some common affiliation, whether it's race or ethnicity or ideology or religion, but separate maybe from citizenship as the primary marker of one's loyalty.
Yeah, that's right.
And identity.
Definitely separate from citizenship.
So do foreign fighters then, do they make a difference for insurgent groups?
They do in both good and bad ways for the groups. The data that I have shows that actually groups that have foreign fighters tend to outperform rebel groups that don't. They win a little bit more, but they lose less. A lot of the conflicts go to stalemate. Mm-hmm. They're extended for years. In the historical cases that I looked at, actually, ironically, not the jihadis in Afghanistan. They made no difference. The Soviets didn't even know they were there. But in the other cases, let's say the Israeli War of Independence, where they got several thousand, World War II combat veterans to come in and give skills that the local fighters didn't have. A lot of governments said yes, they made all the difference in the world. It could be that in a lot of these other cases that the insurgencies that are well organized enough to recruit transnationally are just in a better position to win anyway. But in some cases, the foreign fighters actually do bring really needed experience that at least prolongs the war, if not winning it. In other cases, there's been other people who've worked on Chechnya in particular, where we've seen cases where foreign fighters come in with much more ideological goals than the locals have, and it actually leads to a lot of discord. And we've seen this in every case. The Anbar awakening in Iraq has gotten a lot of attention, but in every case I've looked at, there's been discord between the locals and the foreign fighters who are supposedly there to help them and protect them, where the locals will say these guys are sort of ideological wackos who are
zealots or extremists.
They're worrying about the lengths of our beards, and the foreign fighters, and this goes back to Texas in the 1830s, say, hey, we're here to fight, and these locals are just worried about taking care of their farms or whatever. Right. They're lazy.
They have a livelihood. They have, and this seems to fit with literature on insurgencies generally about the role of local populations, how intense the interests are, and things like that.
That's right. And also, I guess if you have been recruited on this ideological argument that, hey, this is the final battle and it's a fight to the end and you have to do something about it.
And you're 20 years old.
Right. And you don't have any family or property in the line of fire, then it's easier to be
ideologically zealous and doctrinaire. And So is there anything that happens, and this sort of leads us to some of your more recent work too, about what happens when foreign fighters then leave the conflict? So sometimes they'll go and they'll have an effect on the conflict in a local sense, but I assume most of them will go back home. And what do we know happens? What do we think happens when they do?
Well, foreign fighters tend not to have a very good time of it. They have very high casualty rates, so a lot of them don't go home at all. And some that do come back very disaffected. And what we're seeing this decade, I haven't seen any records of it in the past because I think nobody was looking for it, but we're seeing really high rates of PTSD and people coming back to Europe and coming back to Southeast Asia from Syria, which makes sense if you figure they're put in situations that they're maybe not trained for, used as cannon fodder by local commanders. So you get some people who come back and are very disillusioned and speak out against the group, but you do get people who stay loyal to it for decades. There were, some of these, even though, again, a third of them died over there and they didn't have a very good experience, there were veterans groups from Americans who went and fought in the Spanish Civil War who were having, even a few years ago, having 70th anniversary reunions, right?
Oh, wow.
So
because you'd imagine these are like formative experiences, good or bad, that shared trauma or shared experience would be an important piece of that.
Absolutely. So there's perhaps the propensity, if they're not going to engage in militant activity themselves, we've seen returned foreign fighters become effective recruiters, become effective fundraisers. They have credibility in their communities because they've actually walked the walk and they know the right people to help get you over there. So I did become interested in what happens to them. There's some literature from various people have written in the last few years about the propensity for domestic terrorism by returnees. And there's some studies that say it could be as high as, basically 10% of returnees, maximum likelihood estimate could become involved in domestic terrorism. There are other studies that say, well, if you look at people who've come back, most of them are arrested for things like possessing offensive material. Or if you look at attacks, even the worst case scenario attacks like in France and Belgium, these are basically mass shootings. There's no evidence of specialized skills. I don't really get into the question of how likely is it that returnees become involved in domestic terrorism, but I did do a study of looking at the ones who actually did or were arrested trying to. What was the time frame? Because we worry a lot about with returnees, with the question of them becoming sleepers, of having to surveil them indefinitely. There are a lot of countries like the UK and Australia which have passed laws in the last few years saying if you go over there, we're stripping your citizenship and you're going to be somebody else's problem. You can't come home because we can't afford to watch you forever.
Yeah, so these it feels like there are real policy implications for domestic audiences, for the sort of international system more broadly, if you're leaving people in essentially sort of stateless conditions.
Technically,
you're like free radicals out in the.
Well, that's right. I mean, technically, you're not supposed to. No state is supposed to leave its citizens stateless. Right. We have some history. Some history behind the idea of trying to just wash our hands of foreign fighters. I mean, to me, Exhibit A of what happens is Osama bin Laden. The Saudis said, you're not our problem anymore.
Not our problem.
But they go somewhere else. And I think in the internet era, recruitment doesn't need to happen face to face like it did in the past. Mm-hmm. So. And we've seen that there's more credibility to people who are out in the field on social media in Syria. So
so we know foreign fighters, the ones who do survive and maybe return, we know that they can be, like you said, effective recruiters, fundraisers, etc. So they can have an effect on ongoing conflicts. So there's clearly an interest for states to figure out what to do. So can you tell us more about the sort of empirical question that you were asking, which is about, I guess, latency between, like, I guess, the flash to bang of when they get home?
So in the study I just did, we took a look at the lag time between returning, at least from the most recent time overseas as a foreign fighter, to being arrested or carrying out an attack in Western countries. And it turns out that the average time is about 4 to 5 months. There are very few that are beyond a year, almost none beyond the 3-year mark, which matters also for debates about prison sentences for returnees. There's a concern that there are people who are being prevented from going to Syria or people who are being brought back and sent off to prison. And we know there's some links between prison sentences and radicalization. So there's a fear that more people will come out of prisons, and we're only delaying the problem by kicking it down the road. But because so many foreign fighters engage in terrorism so soon after they return, prison sentences have not actually played any role so far.
Okay.
Even the one outlier who it was about 7 years, I think, between returning and engaging in a domestic attack in the UK, he'd spent one night in jail for shoplifting. Prison wasn't a factor there. So it looks like we don't have to worry, based on what's happened so far, we don't have to worry so much about people coming out of prison and then radicalizing and become, after having been a foreign fighter, and then engaging in domestic attacks.
So really, the first few months are critical. After that, the risk is not zero, but pretty small.
That's how I'd put it. There's paramedics talk about this sort of a golden hour that they have this critical time they have to reach people. It looks like we have this sort of dark window of the first 6 months where we need to direct resources for surveillance, for security, for reintegration efforts if that's possible. But after that, it looks like the threat falls off steeply.
Okay. So you started talking a little bit about sort of what might be the policy implications for this for states that are looking at foreign fighters returning from an international civil war or an insurgency. You mentioned the idea of programs to rehabilitate, reintegrate, sort of services, things like that. So that would be one area. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. But also, I assume we're talking about things like surveillance or just sort of watchful waiting in some regards.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, different countries have different approaches. Denmark actually has probably the most generous program where they offer amnesty as long as you haven't basically committed a war crime, and they'll give you whatever service you ask for, whether it's job training, psychological assistance, any sort of counseling. They do this with domestic extremists as well. And they've claimed a really great success rate. It's very controversial within Denmark. It's political football, but their number of people who've gone off to Syria dropped off dramatically, and they haven't had any attacks by returnees. And to me, the question of why the number of recruits dropped off dramatically is not one that gets attention, but it's worth considering. And I'm guessing it might be because so many people do come back disaffected, that if they've come home and gone back to those same networks where they were recruited from originally, they're able to tell people, you know what, I was over in Syria, and it's not what the ISIS recruiters tell you. It's a pretty bad scene. So I think there's some value. Maybe
you don't want to go do that. Instead, you can stay here with, I guess, in a society with a pretty decent social safety net and resources and things like that.
I think there's something to that. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, of course, there's risks either way, but there's probably a value, since we know that people who have gone to become foreign fighters are effective recruiters. They're good at messaging. I would think that the ones who've been there and walked the walk and came back saying this is not what they tell you could be really effective resources for counter messaging, counter narratives.
So that could be exploited on a government side or on a more official.
I think so, or just through sponsorship of the right sort of civil society groups.
Sure. Okay.
That might have more credibility in the communities.
And it sounds like in terms of policy too, what the data would suggest is that on the question of surveillance, the answer is not that you have to surveil these people who are returning for the rest of their lives or even for that long, that you could do some intense sort of watching for a little while, and then maybe the threat dies down.
Yeah, well, that's what the numbers seem to show.
It feels like a really hard policy argument to make. It is.
I mean, it's a homeland security issue, and with any homeland security issue, there's a push, I think, for resilience. The idea that we can't stop every potential threat. We don't have the resources. It would change society in a way that we wouldn't want it to look, even if we did do that.
Undermine values and things like that.
But we have to be able to bounce back from attacks or natural disasters or whatever when they do happen. So would I want to return foreign fighter as my next door neighbor? Not necessarily, but given the alternatives of do we tell them to just go out and join other radical groups in different civil wars around the world, which is what the jihadis have been doing.
Sort of jump from radical movement to radical movement.
Well, that's what's happened. And historically, people didn't do that. They kind of went back to their day jobs, or very few who became radicals. But this started to change. a lot of volunteers in Afghanistan in the 1980s had already been in prison in Arab countries, knew they couldn't go home, and then they were kicked out of Pakistan, and they started looking for other places to go. So they went to Bosnia. They actually got some combat skills that they didn't get in Afghanistan there, and then they diffused out to other insurgent groups in the Philippines and Algeria and Chechnya.
Okay. So the idea of sort of becoming a foreign fighter, becoming your day job like that, and bouncing around seems also like a policy outcome that is undesirable. So if domestic terrorist attacks are undesirable on one end, having a sort of ever-ready pool of people who are willing to take up arms for insurgent groups also seems like a bad idea. So we've got to thread the needle.
Well, that's right. It's kind of pick your poison between the semi-pro jihadis out there and the threat of domestic attacks. But to me, with the threat of domestic attacks, you can watch them. You can make determinations. I'm not saying that there needs to be a policy where you after 6 months it's an automatic cutoff if there's somebody that's deemed a risk.
Let them go and never think about them ever again. But again, these sort of balance, and these are the questions at a strategic level, whether it's Homeland Security or military officers, I think that we're asking people to think through. Is there, if you had, say, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security or the NORTHCOM commander, somebody in front of you, is there one thing that you would want them to hear or that you'd want them to listen to?
I'd want them to think about the possible use of returnees who cooperate, who we know are legit in counter messaging, because I think we've been looking for almost 20 years since 9/11 into counter narratives. If we just find the right story to tell people, they'll listen, and we haven't gotten that far with it. I think everyone acknowledges that. And obviously the right narrative is the story about threat is a big part of the recruitment of foreign fighters, but they go more because of who they are than what they're told. I think we all hear about atrocities happening all over the world, and we say they're terrible, but we don't feel personally compelled to pick up a gun and go travel and do something about it ourselves individually. What we've seen in a few different parts of the world is the people who are most effective at getting individuals who are traveling to become foreign fighters to actually stop and turn around are their moms. Mothers are able to say, hey, look what you're doing to our family. Hey, there's an identity group that you're really affecting here by doing this. So I think if we're able to get returnees who are able to say, I am part of your community, and I've been there, and they're not giving you the whole story.
These sort of community tethers, the family tethers, the things that ground people in a specific place.
Yeah, I think identity. Or even reframing these identities. Hey, you're part of a family group that needs you. Hey, you are a citizen of a country that values you. Or you're part of, we do this a little bit with sports. You're part of a softball team that really needs your help right now.
Right. Sure.
That might actually prevail upon people to not listen to these stories about how they need to go be a hero for this abstract group that they're told about.
Yeah, so I think that sounds like really important advice. Maybe, I don't know, who knows who's listening right now. I will thank you for your time, and thanks for joining us today, and it's been a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu, and have a great day.